It must have seemed like a good idea at the time, although I cannot for the life of me think why. But a few weeks ago, I agreed to give something called a keynote address to this conference. And ever since then, I've become increasingly intimidated and queasy about the prospect of doing so. Partly, I think this is because the events of the last couple of weeks have cast their own peculiar, lurid glow over the word processor of anybody trying to think coherently and historically and broadly about Marxism and about socialism. But partly, too, I think it's because the very word keynote both promises and threatens so much. My Chambers Dictionary says that keynote is the fundamental note, any central principle or controlling thought. Now, I'm not bold enough nor foolish enough to try to provide you with a fundamental note. And I'm certainly not going to prescribe any central principle or controlling thoughts for this conference. So with the Chair's agreement and with your agreement, perhaps we can rename this session. And I'd like to borrow the term that my son used. He came in to the room where I was working on this and he said, "How's it going, your keyhole address?" And I immediately found myself much, much more comfortable with that designation. Because after all, it suggests the perspective of a single peering eye, looked with a narrow field of vision. But then too, there's the function of a keyhole. It is an opening in which others may try their keys to open, to get at that which is closed or distant or hard to reach. And if these comments can provide something of that function, if they can serve as a point of entry concerns of this conference, then I shall be more than satisfied. So let's begin with what is the broader political and intellectual backdrop of this gathering? In which historical setting, in which historical moment are we meeting? And simply to ask this question hints at an immediate paradox. Two very different answers suggest themselves depending upon whether one begins by evaluating the international or the local context. In short, the international and the national perspectives just outlined seem to present quite startlingly different contexts for our conference. I have, of course, as you are already aware, deliberately and overstated them. On the one hand, capitalism resurgent, labor defeated, socialism discredited, and Marxism in headlong defeat. On the other hand, labor insurgent and capitalism in crisis, socialism accorded popular support, and Marxism with at least some intellectual purchase. Every one of those dichotomies would need at least to be nuanced and in some cases quite severely qualified. You'll remember that my highly selective sketch highlighted the structural crisis of South African capitalism, the vitality and social weight of worker organization, and at the level of consciousness, a potential mass base for socialist politics. Now, a preliminary observation must be about a virtual silence at this conference. The shortage of papers on working class politics, on trade unions, and on proletarian consciousness. The Crick paper on the politics of the strike wave of 1990 is a significant exception. It poses important questions about the relationship of intense industrial activism and broader political development. Marxists the world over quite reject the right-wing triumphalism of Fukuyama's End of History or Bush's Next American Century. and I have sketched some of the grounds upon which such a rejection can be based. Equally, there is no room whatsoever for any kind of left triumphalism in South Africa. The notion of any kind of socialist transformation emerging naturally or logically or painlessly from a post-apartheid political order is an article of faith rather than a political program. The ruling class is negotiating, but it has not capitulated. I have already registered some doubts as to the depth and embeddedness of a frequently expressed popular preference for socialism, what Mzala called this populism about socialism. But I want to end, if I may, by returning to what must be pretty basic concerns for Marxists and for this conference. I want to visit those questions, which are: what is the relationship between theory and practice, between the intelligentsia and the working class, between structural conditions and human agency? And I want to try to visit those questions by reminding you of an international comparative perspective or discussion of those issues, and then seeing if that can be applied to the South African case. The treatment I have in mind, the international treatment I have in mind, is Perry Anderson's Considerations on Western Marxism. I suspect that I'm not the only one here who's found this a particularly luminous account of how Marxist theory has developed historically in relation to class struggle. Indeed, his whole book, in a sense, is constructed around the proposition that Marxist theory acquires its proper contours only in direct relation to a mass revolutionary movement. When the latter is effectively absent or defeated, the former is inevitably deformed or eclipsed, writes Anderson. There is, I think quite obviously, a direct correlation between the re-emergence of working class activism and protest in the 1970s and the buoyancy and verve of Marxist inquiry in that decade, and at least in the early years of the 1980s. Secondly, second observation, there is an internal intellectual history that has not yet been written of a generalized shift to the right during the second half of the 1980s. This was manifest in a whole range of ways. In what has been called the ascendancy of social historians over social theorists. In the very different registers used by Fossatu and Kossatu. In economic policy workshops and their prescriptions. And in the recondite vocabulary of post-structuralism. The still to be written history of that shift is going to have to measure in explaining that intellectual shift took place. It's going to have to measure the impact of the state's repression on mass mobilization, the defeats suffered by the labor movement in 1987, the importation of doubt and hesitancy from overseas, the part played by hostility to ultra-leftism and to theory within mainstream politics, and of course the shift of vision from insurrectionary to negotiated outcomes.